The smell of burning flesh would haunt the 25 witnesses for the rest of their lives. What was supposed to be a revolutionary moment in humane execution became a nightmare that lasted 4 agonizing minutes. The year was 1890, and America was about to witness the birth of the electric chair through the tortured death of a Buffalo vegetable peddler named William Kemler. The execution would go so catastrophically wrong that one witness vomited, another fainted, and George Westinghouse himself declared they would have been better off using an axe. Behind this gruesome spectacle lay one of the most ruthless corporate wars in American history. Thomas Edison, the Wizard of Menlo Park, was locked in a bitter fight with industrialist George Westinghouse over which electrical system would power America's future. Edison pushed direct current, while Westinghouse championed alternating current. When New York lawmakers decided to replace the gallows with something more civilized, Edison saw his chance to destroy his rival's reputation forever. He would make sure that Westinghouse's AC current powered the electric chair, hoping to convince the public that AC electricity was synonymous with death itself. The man who would become the unwitting pawn in this electrical war was born William Francis Kemler on May 9, 1860, in Philadelphia's grimy industrial district. His German immigrant parents brought nothing to America but their capacity for hard work and their fondness for alcohol. William's father disappeared when the boy was barely 10, leaving behind a legacy of violence and abandonment that would shape his son's destiny. Young Kemler learned early that life was brutal, unpredictable, and often soaked in whiskey. He dropped out of school before learning to read properly and began working whatever jobs his small hands could manage. By 1889, Kemler had drifted to Buffalo, New York, where he scraped together a living selling vegetables from a decrepit horse-drawn cart. His route took him through the city's poorest neighborhoods, where he hawked wilted produce to housewives who could barely afford even his rock-bottom prices. The work was backbreaking and humiliating, but it kept him in drinking money and occasionally put food on his table. Buffalo's East Side was a rough place filled with immigrants, drifters, and people running from something. Kemler fit right in. Matilda Ziegler, known to everyone as Tilly, was running from her own demons when she met William Kemler. She worked the streets when she had to and took whatever other work she could find when she didn't. Tilly was tough as nails and twice as sharp, but she had one fatal weakness. She fell for men who hit her. Kemler and Tilly moved in together in a ramshackle apartment where the walls were thin, and the neighbors minded their own business. Their relationship was a combustible mix of desperation, alcohol, and violence that everyone could see was heading toward disaster. The couple's fights were legendary in their neighborhood, screaming matches that lasted hours, furniture being thrown, and Tilly's occasional appearance with black eyes or split lips. The other tenants learned to ignore the sounds coming from their apartment, because calling the police in that part of Buffalo was usually pointless. Domestic disputes were considered private matters, and women like Tilly were expected to handle their own problems. The violence escalated throughout the winter and spring of 1889, with each fight becoming more vicious than the last. March 29, 1889, started like any other day in the Kemler household, which meant it started with alcohol and accusations. Kemler had been drinking since breakfast, nursing his resentments about Tilly's prostitution work and his own failures as a provider. Tilly, hungover and exhausted from a long night, was in no mood for his self-pity. The argument began over money, shifted to her work, then exploded into something much darker. Kemler accused her of holding back earnings and seeing clients in their apartment. Tilly, fed up with his jealousy and threats, told him exactly what she thought of his accusations. The fight escalated when Kemler discovered that Tilly had been seeing another man, not for money but for companionship. The revelation sent him into a rage that transcended his usual drunken violence. He stumbled to the corner of their one-room apartment and grabbed the hatchet they used for chopping firewood. Tilly saw the weapon in his hands and tried to run, but the small space gave her nowhere to go. Kemler caught her near the door and brought the hatchet down on her skull with a sickening crack that neighbors heard through the thin walls. What followed was not a murder, but a massacre. Kemler continued hacking at Tilly's body long after she had stopped moving, driven by a fury that seemed to feed on itself. Blood splattered the walls, ceiling, and floor as he struck her more than 20 times with the rusty blade. When he finally stopped, exhausted and covered in gore, Tilly was barely recognizable as human. The neighbors, who had initially tried to ignore the sounds, realized this fight was different. Someone finally summoned the police. Officers arrived to find Kemler sitting calmly beside the mutilated corpse, the bloody hatchet still in his hands. He showed no emotion, no remorse, and no attempt to explain or justify his actions. When asked what happened, he simply said he killed her because she deserved it. The crime scene was so horrific that several officers became physically ill, and the coroner later said it was the worst case of domestic violence he had ever encountered. Kemler was arrested without resistance and taken to Erie County Jail to await trial. The trial of William Kemler began on May 10, 1889, and was notable mainly for its brevity and the defendant's complete lack of interest in his own fate. District Attorney Quinby presented the case methodically, calling neighbors who testified about the couple's violent relationship and the sounds they heard on the morning of the murder. The court-appointed defense attorney made a half-hearted attempt to argue temporary insanity due to chronic alcoholism, but Kemler's calm demeanor after the crime undermined any claim of mental illness. The defendant himself sat quietly throughout the proceedings, occasionally nodding off during testimony. Medical testimony revealed the extent of Tilly's injuries in gruesome detail. The coroner described multiple skull fractures, deep lacerations across her torso, and evidence that she had tried to defend herself before succumbing to the assault. Neighbors testified about Kemler's threats against Tilly and his history of violence when drinking. The prosecution's case was so overwhelming that the defense called no witnesses and made only a brief closing argument asking for mercy. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty of murder in the first degree. Judge Childs sentenced William Kemler to death on May 14, 1889, making him the first person condemned to die in New York's new electric chair. The sentence was to be carried out at Auburn State Prison, where the state had constructed its revolutionary execution device. Kemler received the news with the same indifference he had shown throughout the trial, simply nodding when told he would be electrocuted rather than hanged. What he didn't know was that his death sentence had just made him the most valuable pawn in a corporate war between two of America's most powerful men. George Westinghouse immediately recognized the threat that Kemler's execution posed to his electrical empire. If the public associated AC current with death and execution, his power systems would never gain acceptance in American homes and businesses. Working through intermediaries, Westinghouse secretly funded Kemler's appeals, hiring prominent attorney W. Bork Cochran to challenge the constitutionality of electrocution. The appeals argued that the electric chair constituted cruel and unusual punishment, and that the state was essentially using Kemler as a human guinea pig for an untested execution method. Edison's team fought back aggressively, conducting public demonstrations of AC current's dangers and promoting electrocution as a humane advance over hanging. Edison even tried to popularize the term Westinghouse as a synonym for electrocution, hoping to permanently link his rival's name with death. The legal battle continued for over a year, with each side presenting expert testimony about the effects of electrical current on the human body. Westinghouse's lawyers argued that no one really knew what would happen when 1,000 volts coursed through a human being, making the execution an experiment rather than a punishment. The United States Supreme Court declined to hear Kemler's final appeal on May 23, 1890, clearing the way for the execution to proceed. Auburn's electric chair was a crude wooden contraption that looked more like a medieval torture device than a piece of modern technology. 2 electrodes would deliver the fatal current, with one placed on the condemned person's head and another on the lower back. The electrical system was designed to deliver 1,000 volts of alternating current for 17 seconds, which researchers believed would cause immediate death through disruption of the nervous system. On August 6, 1890, William Kemler was awakened at dawn and prepared for his historic execution, then dressed in a dark suit that had been specially prepared with slits to accommodate the electrodes. At 6:30 a.m., he was led into the execution chamber, where 25 witnesses waited to observe the world's first electric chair execution. Kemler entered the chamber calmly. Prison officials guided him to the electric chair and began the process of securing him with leather restraints across his chest, arms, and legs. The head electrode was carefully positioned on his freshly shaved scalp. while the second electrode was attached to his lower spine through a slit in his clothing. Dr. George Fell, one of the physicians present, later described the moments before the execution as eerily calm. Kemler sat quietly in the chair, occasionally glancing at the witnesses, but showing no signs of fear or distress. Prison officials double-checked all electrical connections and restraints, aware that any malfunction could turn the execution into a public relations disaster. The warden asked Kemler if he had any final words, but he simply shook his head. At exactly 6:38 a.m., the signal was given to activate the electrical current. 1,000 volts of alternating current slammed into Kemler's body with devastating force. His back arched violently against the restraints as every muscle contracted simultaneously. His hands clenched into fists so tightly that his fingernails drew blood from his palms. Smoke began rising from the head electrode as the intense current heated his scalp and hair. The witnesses watched in fascination and horror as Kemler's body writhed against the leather straps, producing a low humming sound as the current flowed through him. After 17 seconds, the current was switched off, and Kemler's body went limp. Prison physician Dr. McDonald immediately stepped forward to examine the body, checking for signs of life. Initially, Kemler appeared to be dead, with no visible breathing or movement. Dr. McDonald announced that the execution had been successful and that death appeared to have been instantaneous. The witnesses began to murmur their approval of the new execution method, believing they had just witnessed a humane and efficient execution. But their satisfaction was short-lived. Within moments of Dr. McDonald's declaration, witnesses noticed that Kemler was still breathing. His chest rose and fell slowly but distinctly, and color remained in his face. The realization that he was still alive sent a wave of panic through the execution chamber. Dr. McDonald examined him more closely and confirmed the horrifying truth. William Kemler was unconscious, but very much alive. The world's first electric chair execution had failed catastrophically. Prison officials frantically began preparations to apply electrical current a second time. The dynamo needed several minutes to recharge, during which witnesses watched in growing horror as Kemler continued to breathe. Blood began to trickle from his mouth and nose, and his body occasionally twitched involuntarily. Some witnesses began to question whether they were watching an execution or a torture session. The delay stretched on agonizingly as technicians worked to prepare the equipment for a second attempt at killing the condemned man. At 6:40 a.m., prison officials activated the electrical system again, this time with 2,000 volts for over a minute. The increased voltage and duration had devastating effects on Kemler's body. His flesh began to burn where the electrodes made contact, filling the chamber with the acrid smell of cooking meat. Steam and smoke rose from his body as the intense current literally boiled his blood and cooked his internal organs. Several witnesses became violently ill from the horrific spectacle, and one reporter later wrote that the smell was worse than anything he had encountered on Civil War battlefields. Kemler's body convulsed even more violently during the second application of current, straining against the leather restraints with inhuman strength. The sound of sizzling flesh mixed with the electrical humming to create a nightmare soundtrack that would haunt witnesses for years. When the current was finally switched off, there was no doubt that William Kemler was dead. His body was severely burned and disfigured, with the electrodes having literally cooked portions of his scalp and back. The execution had taken over 4 minutes from start to finish. Dr. McDonald's examination revealed extensive internal damage caused by the electrical current. Kemler's brain had been cooked by the intense heat, his blood vessels had burst throughout his body, and large portions of his nervous system had been destroyed. The autopsy later showed that the prolonged electrocution had caused massive internal burns and organ failure. What was supposed to be a quick, humane execution had become a gruesome spectacle of technological failure and human suffering. News of the botched execution spread rapidly across the nation and around the world. Newspaper accounts described the execution as barbaric and torturous, with many editorials questioning whether the electric chair represented progress or regression in execution methods. George Westinghouse's comment that they would have done better using an axe captured public sentiment perfectly. The graphic descriptions of Kemler's suffering shocked readers and generated widespread criticism of the new execution method. Despite the controversy, New York and other states continued to use the electric chair for decades, making modifications based on lessons learned from Kemler's execution. The voltage was increased for future executions, and the duration was extended to ensure that condemned prisoners would not survive the first application of current. However, botched electrocutions continued to occur periodically throughout the 20th century, with some prisoners requiring multiple jolts of electricity before dying. The Kemler execution established important legal precedents regarding new execution methods and became a cautionary tale about the dangers of implementing untested technologies in criminal justice. The case also highlighted how commercial interests could influence criminal justice policy, with both Edison and Westinghouse using Kemler's fate to advance their business objectives. Modern scholars have noted that the execution reflected broader tensions between scientific progress and humanitarian concerns in late 19th century America. Contemporary research on botched executions has shown that technological solutions to the problem of causing death do not eliminate the possibility of prolonged suffering. The Kemler case demonstrates how the search for humane execution methods can sometimes produce results that are more horrific than the practices they were designed to replace. His agonizing death became a symbol of the complex relationship between innovation and unintended consequences in American criminal justice. Thank you for watching Death Chamber.